Welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I read through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, the West Australian, and I criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First up, Give Me the Bustle, 22nd of October 2014. I totally disagree with Professor Dora Marinova. Freo's future, coffee or containers, letters. I have lived in the area for nearly 40 years, and on most days I travel along Tideman Road to Port Beach for a swim. I love the ships and the trucks and the smells and the noise and the cranes and the containers and bustle of the port. The last thing I want is a highly urbanised, gentrified Fremantle full of coffee shops. Brian Casey, Bicton. So the backstory is this. Fremantle is our local port. It's the major container port, I believe, for Western Australia. It doesn't really do bulk handling, but it does and it's mostly imports, with the occasional cruise ship coming through. So I think once or twice a month we might get a cruise ship through. But over the recent, actually for the last quite a while, it's been gentrifying. So there's always been a level of gentrification. It's quite famous in local areas for what's called the Cappuccino Strip, which is a long, sort of pedestrianised area of Fremantle, which is full of coffee shops. It is a tourist destination within the confines of Western Australia, or within the confines of Perth at least. And that is a large part of how it is marketed. Now, recently there's been a push to reduce the amount of actual commercial port activities, and it's not so much push, but there has been this proposal by a professor of, I think, town planning or some such like that, urban development. And the idea is to try and convert it into something that is even more touristy than it already is, to attract people to come in and spend their money in local businesses there. And to shift all of these sort of container and sort of industrial stuff to other port facilities further out. Essentially, Fremantle is seen as being prime real estate for that kind of recreation and leisure activity. It sits at the mouth of the Swan River, which runs through most of Perth, and so there's lots of opportunity there to do essentially what Sydney has with their harbour and what other ports around the world have done, which is to turn it away from large container ships and that kind of thing with cranes, etc., etc. Now, there was a whole wave of letters written in, like this one, complaining that they love the bustle of Fremantle, they love the cranes and the containers and things. Which kind of misses the point. For Fremantle to be this thriving locality, it actually needs to attract people in. It always has done. It's always been based on a certain level of tourism. It contains a number of tourist attractions within it. It has a fairly historical side, as much as Australia as we have any history here. It has a fairly historical side to it, and it attracts in a fair number of tourists. And it's always relied on that. And so the proposal was to simply extend that further. Most tourists don't want to come to a working port. Most tourists are not particularly interested in seeing cranes and containers. The locals, on the other hand, may well be, but the locals, unfortunately, the residential locals, aren't really what Fremantle is built for. Fremantle is not a particularly residential area at the moment. It is mainly heavy industry, light industry, services, and commercial enterprise. And so the flurry of people writing in to saying that they didn't want their local area to be shifted like this kind of misses the point that, like any other sort of commercialised area, it's not really run for the residents, it's run for the businesses, and the businesses need customers, and the customers aren't the locals. So, sorry to say it, but I think you're on a loser on that one. Next up, The Effect of Speed, 24th of October 2014. Repetition of a falsehood, particularly by presumed experts, does give it undeserved credibility. The oft-repeated claim that increasing car speeds from 60 km an hour to 65 km an hour doubles the risk of an accident. More obey road speed limits. News, 23rd of the 10th, is a prime example. If speed alone had such an enormous effect with its implications for road trauma, why are no peer-reviewed and internationally replicated studies available which demonstrate this? A.D. Hughes Daith, Riverton. And the bad news for you is that there are. There are actually plenty. It is very well established internationally and here. Actually, Australian research is at the forefront of this, that actually the speeds at which people are driving does account for a significant part of their risk of having an accident. The thing that you misunderstand is the idea that it has such an enormous effect. Now, when they talk about doubling the risk, that does sound like an enormous effect. But what you've got to realise is that your risk of having an accident is actually incredibly low. For example, I've been driving for about 20 years, and in the time that I've been driving, I have one single solitary accident that was very minor with nothing but a little bit of property damage, so no injuries to either party involved. One accident in 20 years. I've done literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of kilometres of driving in that time. And while I probably, or maybe I'm flattering myself, I'm slightly safer than the average, actually I'm probably not. I'm probably about as safe as the average, which means that on average most people probably are having one accident every 20 years or so. So if you double your risk by habitually driving at 5 kilometres over the speed limit, you're still only one crash every 10 years or so, which is basically negligible, considering that the kind of crash that I had very minor property damage. In fact, there was the smallest scratch on the other car. So, when we talk about doubling the risk, on an individual level, to any individual driver, that's no big deal. My risk is very low. Doubling a very low number is still a very low number. But here's the important thing. At a population level, that's a big deal. So every time we double the risk, so if the entire population decided they were going to drive at 5 kilometres faster than they or otherwise would have, then we would double the number of accidents we were having, which is double the number of deaths and double the number of injuries, which is actually quite a lot. Because we're talking about, I think the road toll here in West Australia, out of our 2-odd million population, is about, it's under 100 a year. So that would be an extra sort of 60 or 80 people dead every year unnecessarily, simply for driving 5 kilometres over the speed limit. That's what double the risk means. Now, the research for this is about almost 20 years old now. Came out in 1997, came out of Adelaide, actually, interestingly. And it showed that actually your individual risk increases exponentially the faster you drive. So 5 kilometres over the speed limit of 60 k's doubled your risk. Another 5 kilometres doubled it again to sort of 4 times the risk. And another 5 kilometres actually more than doubled it again to 10 times the risk. So driving at 15 k's over the speed limit at about 75 k's an hour, you're at 10 times the likelihood of having an accident than you would at 60. The other thing that skews is the amount of injury sustained. So you're not only more likely to have a crash at higher speeds, but you're more likely to have more serious crashes. Because of the way that braking works, is that the sharpest reductions in your speed come at the end of your braking, which means that when you have a crash where you otherwise wouldn't, you also tend to have higher impact speeds. So pedestrians, for example, will experience much greater injuries for only small increases in speed, because it's the difference between not being hit at, say, low speed, like 5 kilometres an hour, and being hit by 40 kilometres an hour, which is a linear increase in the speed that the driver was doing, but it results in a non-linear increase in the amount of speed when they impact at the pedestrian. So, all of this is actually really well established, and there is actually really good evidence for. Now, you won't find this in the newspaper. You do have to do a little bit of digging like I did. But it turns out, actually, this is really quite well accepted across the world. And it's been part of the reason why we've seen a steady decrease in speed limits across the world in particular, but also in Australia here. Because we know that at a population level, it does a great deal to reduce injuries. But also, interestingly, it doesn't do much to decrease average journey times. So when we shifted from a 60 kilometre limit on most urban roads to a 50 kilometre limit, this had the increase of to average journey times was something in the order of about 30 seconds. So people's average journeys here in Perth are about 10 to 15 minutes on average, and on that they got an extra 30 seconds or so because the speed limits had been reduced. In return for that extra 30 seconds on 30 seconds out of a 10-minute average drive, we got something like a 16% decrease in accidents, which is a staggering amount, given that it was almost a negligible impact on people's actual, journey times. So that's why there's actually really good evidence for this. It is well established. It is published. It's out there. You just have to look for it. Not in this newspaper, but somewhere where they actually were interested in these kind of things. Next up. How Infallible, 25th of October 2014. The report, Catholic Bishops Rebuff Pontiff on Homosexuals, World 20th of the 10th, is puzzling. The conservatism of the bishops responsible for the rebuff appears to be inconsistent. Has it not been a creed of the Church of Rome to view the Pope as infallible? When did the decline in his infallibility begin? David Pritchard Spalding. This is a very common misconception, not just amongst non-Catholics, but even amongst Catholics themselves. The doctrine of papal infallibility, and interestingly lesser known, of the Church's infallibility, as represented by the, Committee of Bishops, does not apply to the Pope in general. The Pope is, in Catholic doctrine, is held to be a human being with all of the flaws and errors that human beings have, who has the same sins as everybody else, the same temptations, and he is generally not considered to be, in line with Catholic doctrine, we are all sinners. As human beings, we are all afflicted with sin. What the doctrine of papal infallibility says is that there are particular pronouncements that the Pope can make, or the Church, that are infallible. So not that the Pope is infallible, but that some of his pronouncements can be infallible if they're made in a particular way, and therefore are within the apostolic tradition. That is, essentially, he is acting as in keeping with, I think, the Apostle Peter, I think is where they're derived from. The idea basically being that he can be inspired by the Holy Spirit to make these pronouncements, which they themselves are infallible. Not that he himself as a person is infallible. And therefore his position on a range of things of church matters may or may not be infallible. They're not infallible. They may or may not be right, because he himself is not infallible. Now, as an atheist, I don't believe in any of that crap, but I do value being correct on things and actually understanding what you're criticising. So if you're going to criticise Catholics for the idea of papal infallibility, the Church does not actually believe. The doctrine is not that everything the Pope does is right. In fact, interestingly, when I try to look up a list of things which are considered, statements that are considered infallible, there is disagreement over precisely which ones. It was only in the 1850s that this was actually codified. And so some lists would only list about literally half a dozen papal pronouncements in the last 2,000 years that are considered infallible. And they're really on sort of really core doctrinal stuff that makes no real difference to anybody. Like the fact that Mary is, a saint or holy or something like that. So things like that. There are no sort of papal infallible teachings on things like homosexuality. There just aren't. And so for the bishops to disagree with the Pope over his stance that he's taking currently towards homosexuality or how we should treat homosexual people or whatever, is not actually an issue of papal infallibility. Now, I don't say this in defence of the Church. What I say this in defence of is there are plenty of things that you can criticise the Church for. The Catholic Church in particular is a horrible institution that has done a hell of a lot wrong and has no moral standing whatsoever. The few things they get right for the wrong reasons. They do good things to people because they see that as part of their Christian faith, which is a terrible reason to be doing it. And so I say this only to encourage people to criticise the Church for things that they actually get wrong. There's nothing worse than mounting a bad argument against an organisation that is already terrible and has many legitimate problems. Next up, how to stay out of jail, 27th of October 2014. There is a quick and easy solution so that there are not any further deaths of any Australians in any of our jails. Premier vows to take jail deaths personally. News 24th of the 10th. Nobody break any laws that warrant incarceration of the perpetrator. Problem solved. Jeff Vickers Greenwood. So the backstory to this is a Aboriginal woman recently died while in police custody. So what is commonly referred to as being in jail. She was in police custody over unpaid fines of about $1,000. And while in custody, she died. Now, there's been... The reports of the incident suggest that the police grossly missed their duty of care to actually look after her while she was in their custody. She was being held in a police lockup, which is generally considered to be inappropriate to be held for any length of time. And she was sick and asking for help, apparently, when she died. And had been sick for a period of time, and the police apparently had not taken any of that seriously and dismissed her concerns about her illness and then not got her medical attention. This is what's reported and alleged at this point. There's not a lot of information of a sort of solid nature. Obviously, the police themselves aren't particularly forthcoming. And there will be a coronial inquest, as there always are into these things. So, this also occurs within the context that historically there have been a large number of Aboriginal deaths in custody. Aboriginal people die in custody at a large rate. They're also incarcerated at a large rate, which means that Aboriginal deaths in custody actually account for a large percentage of Aboriginal deaths overall, which is a damning indictment of the state of Aboriginal people within our society. And this is just, in some ways, yet another one. Not that long ago, we had an Aboriginal person who died in the back of a police transit van because the van's air conditioning broke, and he died of heat exhaustion while in transit. It's these kind of incidents which should be appalling to any reasonable person in our society, that we would just let people die because of a lack of air conditioning, and because the camera that the drivers were supposed to be monitoring this person over either wasn't working or they were not paying due attention, so they just didn't even notice that he just died while in their custody. Here we have another incident where somebody's died. Now, the Premier has come out and said he takes this very personally and wants to do something about it, and will probably hold some kind of inquiry. And we generally, there is always a coronial inquiry whenever somebody dies in custody, and so they will do this in this case. Whether or not the recommendations thereof actually get implemented is another question altogether. And whenever something like this happens, people always pop up to say, well, if you hadn't broken the law, it wouldn't have happened anyway. Now, one, this is just straight out victim blaming. This person had $1,000 of unpaid fines. This means that the kinds of offences that she may or may not have committed, I'm not sure what these fines were. We don't usually lock people up over unpaid fines unless they're court fines. I could be wrong on that, but generally it means that you have committed an offence, you've been convicted of it, and you've been issued a fine, you haven't paid the fine, so then we lock you up until something or other. So the current rate, well, last time I worked in the prison system here, the current rate was about $200 a day for fines. So if you had unpaid fines and you happened to be in jail, you could have your fines paid off by simply spending extra days in jail at a rate of about, I think it was $150 to $200 a day. That means that her $1,000 fine debt was about a week in jail. That's the most it was worth in terms of fair retribution, fair punishment within our society. To say that somehow, or to imply that somehow she deserved to die for having committed whatever crime she'd committed, is just straight out victim blaming. She did not deserve that. Nobody with $1,000 worth of unpaid fines deserves to die as a result. The death penalty here, we don't even have the death penalty because we don't think that people deserve to die for crimes they've committed, not even the most heinous crimes that they've committed. We as a society determined that we are better than that. And here we have a situation where people will say, well, if you just didn't commit crimes, we wouldn't have this problem with people dying in custody. And the other thing is, you say it's an easy solution. It's not an easy solution. Societies everywhere for all time have tried to prevent people from committing crimes. This is a common societal problem. We have so far managed to get our crime rates at probably historically low levels in our society, but it is not an easy problem to solve. And simply telling people not to break laws, or even allowing them to die in custody, does not reduce offending. Certainly not any lower than we're already at. So it appalls me when people always take these callous views. It appalls me when anybody takes any view other than it is absolutely unacceptable that people should die in custody. That's the only stance that I can think of that is reasonable. Especially people who die in custody for things as petty as $1,000 of unpaid fines. Last up, Whose Children, 27th of October 2014. In Friday's West, the lawyer of a convicted drug dealer urged the sentencing judge to consider the impact a long jail term would have on his, the dealer's, 2 sons and a young daughter. Drug lord faces long jail stretch, News 24th of the 10th. Have I missed something? Shouldn't the convicted drug dealer have been the one to consider the children? He didn't consider them, but the judge is expected to. A. Butler, Pinjarra. Yes, the judge is expected to make some consideration of that. Now, I'm a little conflicted about the general principle about whether a person's family situation, say, should be considered when we are determining their punishment for their crime. This seems to suggest that people who happen to have dependents, children or whatever, should be treated differently from offenders who don't. We could extend this to other areas. So somebody who happens to be a small business owner that employs, a number of people, should they have that taken into consideration during sentencing, so that they maybe get let out, so that on a suspended sentence, say, so that they can operate their business and provide employment, whereas somebody who doesn't have that, isn't in that position, shouldn't. I don't necessarily buy that argument per se, but be that as it may, in this particular case, and it has been in our law for quite a while, that we do take into account for at least some offenders. I think if you're on the borderline of maybe you're going to get sent to jail, maybe you're not going to get sent to jail, they do seem to take into account whether you have small children who are dependent upon you. And so people who care for their children probably get some, as far as I can tell, do get some consideration so that they're less likely to get sent to jail. This is people on the borderline. Now, historically, this has been one of the few sources of sexism against men. And it is a result of the patriarchal society, that the patriarchal values that women are expected to be child carers. And what that has actually meant historically is that women who commit crimes get it taken into consideration, the fact that they are caring for small children, some of them, and therefore get more lenient sentences, or get non-custodial sentences where otherwise they might have done. So this has actually been one of those situations where patriarchal values do harm men. Now, I'm not sure whether this drug dealer is a man or a woman. It doesn't actually say. Back to this question, should the judge consider it? Well, the basic argument against it is that, for the judge taking that into consideration, is that actually considering the welfare of these children. So you're right, the drug dealer did not take into consideration the welfare of their child necessarily when they were committing these crimes. And you're right, they should have. As the parent, I have nothing but as a parent myself, but even as a non-parent, I have nothing but condemnation for them. They should absolutely have considered their children before committing these crimes. They should have absolutely considered the impact that their offending might have had on their children. And in fact, that's one of the main things that we used to hammer into the offenders that I've worked with in prisons, was to continually remind them of the impact that their offending was having on their family. Now, the fact that this guy didn't, or this woman didn't, doesn't mean that as a society we just throw our hands up and say, well, fuck those children. They happen to have a criminal for a parent, so bad luck. We as a society are not going to take any kind of responsibility for the impact that it has. As a society, we don't do that. We say, well, these children are actually a social responsibility. We have a responsibility to them to try and ensure that they have as best an upbringing as possible. Now, whether that should extend to leniency towards their parents who have committed crimes, I'm not sure, and I'm willing to be convinced otherwise. But certainly, their well-being is something that us as a society should take into account, because we as a society aspire to be better than drug dealers. So we don't say, well, the drug dealer didn't care for them, so we shouldn't either. No, we say, they didn't consider the impact that their offending was going to have on their children, but we will. We will consider as a society the impact that our actions will have on these children. And that's a pretty good reason to be thinking about this. Anyway, that's it for this week. I've had a couple of Law and Order rants, which I haven't had much of recently. It's been all burqas and terrorists and ISIS and stuff. It's nice to get back to some old school Law and Order issues. Hope you're all doing well. I feel much better for having had a rant, and I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See ya.